Welcome to the HMO Property Show. By investors, for investors. Catch us weekly as we discuss all things cash flow positive property investing. Whether you're a seasoned investor, a new landlord, or just curious about property investing, this is the podcast for you. Sponsored by the Co-Living Collective, your trusted partner in creating vibrant and sustainable shared living experiences. Visit us at colivingcollective.com.au to learn more.
Welcome back to the HMO Property Show. I'm your host, Neil Gibb, as always, and today I've got one of our finance experts on the podcast. It's Mr. Chris Morris. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Neil. Nice to be here.
Very, very pleased, and it's a pleasure to have you, mate.
Thanks.
I know you're a busy man at the minute. Today we're specifically going to talk about investing in real estate in self-managed super funds, and more specifically around new build properties and self-managed super funds. So before we get into it, I'm going to be incredibly boring and give everybody a disclaimer and say that the information in this podcast is exactly that. It's just information. It's not advice. And if you do take this information and go to use it, please do not blame us, especially if you make money. But before you do use any of this information, we recommend that you seek professional advice before making any investment decisions. And this is just to make you aware of some of the things that are out there at the minute that you might not be aware of, and some of the things that some of our clients, and we're probably doing about 30 or 40 of these deals at the minute, aren't we?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's quite a few of them in the system.
Yep.
So we're going to talk about the process and the involvement to getting a new build HMO or a new build NDIS property in your self-managed super fund, because there's a little loophole out there called a one-part contract. Absolutely. So Chris, who are you, mate? Why should I be asking you these questions today?
All right, so a little bit about me. I've been in finance for close to 23 years now. Yeah. I was also a financial planner for 16 years as well, so I understand that side of the equation, so hence the understanding of self-managed super funds, and a large portion of my existing client base have also got a significant investment portfolios as well. So in the period of time I've been in this industry, I have largely been working with property investors, and quite a lot of those clients are doing probably non-normal type properties, so your NRAS type properties, your self-managed super fund investment properties, now obviously more recently into the co-living and NDIS space as well.
Cash flow lovers, by the sound of it.
Cash flow lovers, absolutely.
Sound like my type of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's definitely a drive towards that now, specifically with interest rates being higher. People are feeling the cost of living pressures, obviously, on a day-to-day basis in their own lives, so they're also looking to that cash flow as opposed to future growth type mindset. That's sort of what I'm seeing. The reason I sort of ended up in this sort of specialist lending space, I want to work in a space that I guess is challenging and needs some technical support.
Definitely brings
for
the challenges,
clients.
this, right?
Absolutely, it does. Yeah. So certainly not in that sort of first home buyer basic sort of lending space, and I enjoy being an expert in a field, and I would certainly consider myself to be someone who's got great experience in this space now. So yeah, you obviously mentioned the one-part contract space as well. It's something that has been around for a while, but it's not commonly used, and probably a lot of people aren't very aware of how it works. So the one-part contract space is, in relation to self-managed super funds, is because within the self-managed super fund or superannuation environment in general, you can't construct or build a property with borrowings.
Inside your self-managed super fund.
Inside a self-managed super fund.
So no one would use this process outside of a super fund, would they? This is specifically for super funds?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's the way of, I guess, bypassing that restriction of being able to build without paying cash. Now, you can actually build property inside super funds using cash, but most people don't have that level of cash available to particularly build something that is a cash flow positive property, which tends to be sort of on a higher end of value. So this allows people to to borrow money to do that. The other thing, which is a consideration of why you would lend money to do something like this as opposed to pay cash, even if you did have a significant balance in your super fund, is within a self-managed super fund you have what they call an investment strategy, and it basically means you need to be conforming to that investment strategy on an ongoing basis, which also means you shouldn't have all your eggs in one basket as well. So you should have other strategies in place with the cash in your account. So to be able to allow extra money to remain for other purposes, using a one-part contract, which will allow you to construct a property inside super fund, will leave funds there. So you're actually being compliant with your fund.
Yeah.
Okay. Everyone's in an individual situation. Everyone's investment strategy will be slightly different. But if you're looking at the sole purpose test, which is something that the self-managed super funds or any super fund has, it's really about having diversification and balance within your fund, and an objective of having a benefit for retirement, both from an income stream and a wealth position point of view.
And why do you think we're seeing? It feels like a lot of people are doing this now. Why are you thinking we're seeing this trend or this move to people wanting new build product inside their self-managed super fund, specifically property as well, because that's what we're talking about today, right?
Absolutely, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. One of them would be obviously that ability to be able to leverage, and stock availability is another big part as well. So when you're talking sort of unique property classes, like obviously what HMO deal with the NDIS and the co-living space, if you were to go out and try and find an established property, it's like finding a needle in a haystack, basically. Yeah. So there are obviously other advantages as well, which are with a brand new property, all of your depreciation is still remaining, and it's a perfect property from an investment perspective, with maximising all of those sort of benefits that you get with a new build. So I'd definitely say that was the main reason. And to be, as I said, to be able to acquire an asset otherwise you wouldn't be able to find because of the lack of availability. Yeah. So,
and people love property as well, right?
Oh, absolutely.
You can still, people buy shares and they get a little certificate, but you invest in a property, and a lot of people like to drive past them and make sure that they're still there, that they haven't blown away in the wind.
Absolutely. And look, being a planner previously as well, the thing I guess I picked up from being a planner was that while a number of asset classes make sense if you're trying to talk about the ultimate financial decisions, a lot of clients aren't comfortable with certain assets, whether they be shares or managed funds. Some of it is probably a lack of understanding. Some of it is probably things they've heard from friends and family that have strayed them away from that. But I think one of the things that you just mentioned is a big part of that is they like to be able to see, touch, and know they're owning bricks and mortar. Yeah. And obviously with these asset classes we're talking about in co-living and NDIS, that positive cash flow, leveraged positive cash flow, is also really appealing to a number of people out there in the marketplace at the moment.
Absolutely. So, I think you mentioned earlier as well, you're seeing a lot more people turning and chasing yield over the capital growth as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think, we're obviously seeing some decent growth, particularly in WA at the moment, with property values. But nationally, we've had a fairly stagnant growth sort of experience over the last 10 years or so, as I'm sure you could attest to as well. So people are starting to go, well, I don't feel as comfortable relying on capital growth as being my source of wealth as I head into retirement. Also, as I said, with that cost of living pressure that people are feeling, they're starting to think, well, yield is more secure than that prospect of having something at the tail end, knowing that in retirement that cost of living pressure is more than likely going to be there still. Yeah. So,
well, the cash flow from your investments pays for these reoccurring bills that pop up every now and again. We went shopping in Coles the other day, me and Joe, and we came out with 2 bags, $380
Yep.
And we didn't buy anything different to what we normally buy. Well, I was stood there scratching my head, saying, "Joe, what have we actually bought there?" She said, "Just the normal stuff."
Away.
Yeah.
I know.
So if you've got cash flow, you don't have to work any harder to pay for that increase in your shopping. You just have to. Your property just produces that cash flow every single week.
Absolutely.
It's magical.
Yeah.
So one part contracts then. What is it? How does it work? And
Okay. So obviously everyone's situation is different, but how a one-part contract works is effectively a property is put forward, obviously by you in this situation, and it's a house and land package. As I mentioned, it doesn't meet the SIS Act to actually borrow to construct that within, hence the one-part contract comes in play. So it's a third-party provider that effectively takes on the construction of that property on behalf of the client and on behalf of the client's super fund. It is constructed externally of the super fund, and on completion it's moved back into the super fund as a completed property, which then meets the SIS Act and the ability to have a brand new property which is effectively established and ready to go.
Yeah.
So,
So we've got prior to that construction, we've got two contracts: one land contract, one build contract. But when the product's finished, it gets sold as a finished product, just on a standard offer and acceptance.
Absolutely.
One contract. Into the self-managed super fund.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the pros and cons of that on the back end as well is the investor would have to pay stamp duty on the full contract price, not the land value.
Absolutely.
Going into the self-managed super fund. But like you said, they get a brand new asset, cash flow positive, in the self-managed super fund with all the benefits that you get.
Absolutely. And look, as I mentioned previously, if you're out there even trying to find an established property to avoid having to go down the one-part contract, you're in the same position anyway.
Yeah.
And they're not available.
We've had since 2014, since we started investing in this type of asset, 3 clients have sold their properties.
Yeah.
3 clients in 10 years.
Well, it says something as well, doesn't it? You know.
There's nothing else to put your money into, so why would you sell them?
Absolutely.
So if you've got a self-managed super fund and you sat there twiddling your thumbs waiting for somebody to sell, chances are
you might be already retired before it comes up. Absolutely. Yep.
So the one-part contract thing, we bring a block of land, we bring the bill contract to the party, and we say, John's self-managed super fund wants to purchase this in the future. But John's self-managed super fund doesn't sign that land contract or bill contract, do they?
No, not the 2 parts. No.
That gets signed by the third-party provider.
Signed by the third-party provider. What is actually signed early, though, is an option contract between the obviously the self-managed super fund and the third-party provider. That option contract basically says at the point of completion, it will be converted over to you and moved into the super fund. So it's not though the client has any sort of control, I guess, on the end product, because it is an option contract which allows that to happen in the future, but they're not the ones actually, as you said, signing the land contract or the building contract. They're effectively taking ownership of the one-part contract at the tail end, ready to move into the super fund.
So cash-wise and the movement of cash-wise, does a self-managed super fund need to invest in money at the start of the process, or do they wait until the end of the process for that to happen?
No, it's definitely done up front. And what you're funding, sort of without going into too much detail, but you're funding your normal deposit and costs as if you would buying it as an established property up front.
20%?
About 20%, yep. And then there's around a 10% sort of additional on that, so let's say 30% all up, which covers the fees of the one-part contract provider plus the holding costs during that construction phase. The beauty about that, obviously, for the purchaser is there's nothing else until the tail end. So you know what you're up for up front, and there's nothing further until that becomes the option is actually executed and it moves from the one-part contract provider into the super fund.
And is there any construction risk for the self-managed super fund, or is that all passed to the third-party provider?
The third-party provider is taking on that risk. And there's even a bit of time frame tolerance in there as well, because the average construction takes about 12 months. But there is a few months after that period where the third party will actually take on some of that overshooting of time risk as well, which really does give the consumer a bit of sort of comfort in that process as well.
So they've got no time frame blowouts, no construction risk. It's all passed over, and then they just sit at the end waiting for the product to be finished.
Absolutely.
Can we put tenants or participants in place prior to that changeover into the self-managed super fund?
No,
we have to wait.
Yep.
Empty product.
Yep.
Cool. And with the deposit that they pay at the start, what happens to that deposit? Does that sit in the real estate trust account? Does that sit with the solicitor? Does that get used in any way by the actual third party?
Yeah, so it moves to the third party, and it is used to fund, obviously, that deposit.
Yep.
Because what's effectively happening outside of the super fund is that third party provider is actually securing their own finance off the back of effectively a conditional finance approval for the self-managed super fund. So that deposit is required for them, but obviously at the tail end, that equity is already available within the property at the tail end, and the additional funds are then used obviously to fund those interest costs and other ancillary costs that come about from doing it as a two-part into a one-part contract.
So client or the self-managed super fund pays a 20% deposit plus the ancillary costs. Third-party provider applies for the finance with the lender. They use construction finance to build the property outside of the self-managed super fund, and then when it's finished, there's the put and call option, which forces the self-managed super fund to take the contract and moves over into their self-managed super fund.
Absolutely.
Beautiful. Who made this up?
I know, it's brilliant.
Let's talk about the lending for self-managed super funds, because prior to any of that happening as well, we need to sit them down with you to make sure that they can actually get the lending for SMSF. So what's the parameters in lending around that like?
Interestingly enough, and I think there's probably a lack of knowledge in self-managed super funding lending out there. So realistically, your self-managed super fund is an entity within itself. So it's not connected to someone's personal debts, liabilities or income outside of super fund. So when we're talking about a lending, what we're actually looking at is the self-managed super fund by itself. Now, and it also is beneficial because of the cash flow positive element with these particular types of investments, because servicing the loan within the super fund, from my experience, has been relatively strong. Okay, there does need to be some contribution history within the fund. So how the lender does the serviceability is they look at the contributions that have been going into the fund historically, whether it be an existing retail fund about to become a self-managed super fund or an existing super fund self-managed that's got contributions, plus the potential yield of the property that is going to go into the super fund. So most of the time, external income or serviceability doesn't come into account when we're talking about self-managed super fund lending.
Correct.
The balance does need to be reasonably high because of that 30% requirement, 20% plus the ancillary costs. But that's really the only sort of restriction I tend to see is with that balance.
The balance, yeah.
Not so much the serviceability.
And we've seen that balance requirement increase recently because construction costs have increased, land costs have increased, and every time that increases, your 30% nudges up and up and up and up.
Absolutely.
So, without throwing any absolute numbers out there for example case, if it's $1 million property, you're going to need $300,000 to do the deal, roughly. Plus you need that buffer in there, which you mentioned earlier too, as well.
Yeah, so the holding costs and so on.
So on $1 million deal, they'd need what, $350K minimum.
Yeah, let's just say three to 400, depending on the property itself. Now the other thing, which is probably worth talking about, is when you do have a deficit in your balance within the super fund, the options that you have. Now, as I said, this is general advice and everyone's situation's different, but these options are available to everybody. So you have obviously concessional and non-concessional contributions. With concessional contributions, depending on your balance, you can actually use catch-up provisions, which means you can contribute more in one financial year to bring your balance up. You've obviously got then the non-concessional contributions, which will allow someone to put in a bigger lump sum from post-tax dollars. And then the other option, which many people aren't aware of, is the potential of raising equity externally to the super fund and creating a loan agreement between the individual and the super fund to potentially give you that balance. And again, as I said, every client situation is different, but there are definitely options that are available. Yeah. Another one, which is one that is a potential but probably less utilised, is you can bring other members into the super fund with their balances. So if you wanted to have other people involved in the investment, you could bring family members and so on into the fund who have got funds as well.
Right.
So there are a number of ways of getting the balance up to suit.
Does that affect the lending in any way? Because we've tried to do joint ventures outside of super, and it's become a bit too complex, and we've shut all that down now. Yeah. But in the self-managed super fund realm, it's a little bit straightforward.
It is, yeah. Because I mean, at the end of that, it's still the same scenario. We're not talking about having to fund living expenses for individuals. It's encased in the actual entity of the super fund itself. So same things apply: balance and contribution history and yield from the property that you hold. And also the other thing to point out is any other investments that the self-managed super fund has as well, because any yield that comes from that goes towards being able to service debt. So as long as the overall contributions and that income and the balances are there, then you're fine.
Cool.
Yep.
Cool. What's the sort of LVR, interest rates? Is it non-recourse lending as well inside a super fund?
It is, yeah.
Cool. What is non-recourse lending for the people that don't know?
So it's basically limited to being inside the super fund itself and to the asset that the debt is against. So there's other considerations within that, but it's limited to what the recourse for the lender is with the debt that they're basically providing.
Cool.
So,
interest rate and LVRs, what are we looking at there?
They do vary. You are sort of capped to about an 80% lend. Okay.
Still good in a super fund.
Well, it is, absolutely. Yeah. Particularly when we're talking about these one-part contract type arrangements. Outside of super, you tend to be able to get slightly higher LVRs as well, but there are fees and charges relative as well. So a sweet spot is definitely that 80% mark, and interest rates sort of vary anywhere from sort of 6.8 right up to sort of high sevens. Again, everyone is different, every situation is different, but that's the sort of benchmark you're talking about. Comparatively to outside of super lending, though, it's not that far off. We're not paying 12, 15% or anything ridiculous like that. And if you are comparing against someone with, say, a normal negative geared property within a super fund, the rates are relatively comparable.
Yeah.
So you're not paying a premium as such to have this type of property within the super fund.
Yeah. Okay. So as this is kind of grown and we've evolved as a company and we've started working with you, we've also got the team there that can help people go from their standard superannuation to self-managed super fund. Without giving any specific advice, can we talk about the process that's in line there that people have to go through to go from standard to self-managed super?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you mentioned, we work with other experts, and it's definitely the one thing I would say, always have experts in each field of everything you do, 100%. To guide you through the process. It's not something you want to do yourself because there is a lot of intricacies with it, and people that you can trust as well. So obviously, as you mentioned, we've built a team of people that we trust, and the establishment of a super fund or even the amendment of a structure of an existing super fund is something that we obviously do as part of this process. So to hold a property within a super fund using borrowing, you need what they call a bare trust or a custodian trust. And that has an individual trustee with it as well. That will hold the liability and the property on behalf of the self-managed super fund. So that would be something that would need to be established. That bare trust only holds one asset, so you'd need one per asset that you have. The trustee can be a trustee for multiple bare trusts, but you need a bare trust for each individual asset. So again, when we're setting up either the bare trust or a new self-managed super fund from someone that's already got retail or industry super and moving into this space, the team that we use in that space will guide people and give people clear explanation of why and what's happening, because there is a bit to that process as well, but absolutely everyone will be handheld through that process and understand what's required and the costs and everything else that's relative to that.
Yeah.
Yep.
We essentially set the system up to hold your hand from
absolutely.
from the very first point all the way through at the very end.
Absolutely. And the thing I commonly say to clients as well, because there is a lot to take in, is, how do you eat an elephant? One piece at a time. Yeah. If you try and get your head around every element in one go, you probably won't absorb. But I'd like to think that the way I work and the way you guys work, and all of our other experts, progressively educate clients throughout the process. So by the time we've got to a settlement at the tail end, clients are fully aware of why and what they've been doing, and are effectively become an expert in their own right because of that knowledge that we have conveyed to them throughout the process as well, which again I think is important with the people that you actually do work with.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
it's very easy to just say sign here and not have explanations given to you as to what we're doing and why we're doing it. Yeah. And that's something I certainly do, and I'm confident with everyone else in our sphere, if you like, of professionals that work with our clients, that do for those. Yeah. Particularly new self-managed super fund clients.
Yeah. And the reason that we wanted to record this podcast today was because people ask a lot of questions around it, because it is complex.
Absolutely.
So if you are listening to this because we've shared it with you because we want you to understand the process. Go back, listen.
Yeah.
If you need to listen to it 10 times to understand it, go for it. That's why we recorded it.
Absolutely.
And if you have any questions, reach out to myself anytime. Any risks associated with the one-part contracts that we haven't discussed, Chris?
Look, there's risks to everything.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think one thing I would say as an overall statement there is understand those risks up front before you make any decisions. You could go and buy a standard negative geared property outside of super. It still comes with elements of risk.
100%.
So being clear on what those risks are, and I know, talking to yourself or talking to me or talking to the guys that do the self-managed super fund setup and so on, ask those questions. What are the risks involved? Specifically with the one-part contract in relation to risk, there are definitely risks involved, but it's dependent on the individual situation. How much balance is in super, age of the client, the property they're buying. So it's definitely a very individual case, and my suggestion there, as I said, would be literally ask the questions, understand. Because if you understand, you're making an educated decision. And when I was a financial planner, it was exactly the same thing I used to say. Understand what you're getting into, because it's at the end of the day, it's your decision, and the outcome is yours.
Yes.
So,
and it's their hard-earned money as well.
Absolutely.
Which worked hard for to get in that super fund. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Be across what you're doing.
Yep.
Can a self-managed super fund refinance if the property goes up in value? Can we redraw cash out of that property inside the self-managed super fund and reinvest it into another self-managed super fund deal?
You can't actually, which is an interesting one, because it's actually a big difference, and probably a misconception that most people have. The lending opportunities are not where the issue lies. It's to do with the SIS Act and LRBA sort of borrowing arrangements. So you can't even borrow money to maintain a property. So you have restrictions on what you can do to an existing property. So you can't improve the value of a property. You can't renovate a property, and you can't put additions on a property within a self-managed super fund. So, and to be honest, that when you actually look at it, that's where the logic comes from not being able to construct a property inside super, because it's significantly improving the value of a block of land. It's something that's been in the SIS Act for a long time, and I don't see any reason why that will move. The other thing which to add to that as well. A lot of people think, well, okay, I've got $1 million property in my super fund. It's only owing $200,000. I've got heaps of equity. I want to use that equity to go and buy another property. Same thing. It's not available equity, and largely comes down to what I mentioned before about needing an individual bare trust per property. So they're not, you can't have two properties within one bare trust, so you can't cross-collateralise them or use the equity in that. So I think one of the things that people need to consider when we're talking about how much you borrow as well is what your future plans are around whether you're looking to acquire other assets or other property in the future, because of that limitation of being able to use equity. Sometimes you strategically need to know how much money you want to leave in your fund or continue to accumulate in your fund for future reasons. Right. Now, that's going to be individual with everybody, and definitely seek advice about what suits you and what your goals are. But these are things, obviously, when you're talking about how much you want to contribute as a deposit and so on, need to be factored, because it isn't the same as borrowing personally. You don't have that ability to extract equity for future purposes.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
So to purchase another property within the self-managed super fund, they just need more contributions and then apply for a separate loan through the new bare trust.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you've got to accumulate in your cash account within super, or have other investments that you can liquidate to bring more money into cash. Or, as I said, there's other options like loan agreements between the client personally and the self-managed super fund. And again, some of our experts can give guidance on how you would set up those loan agreements, but in loose terms, it just needs to be a market standard sort of interest rate between the individual and the super fund. But there's obviously other things around that as well, but it's certainly an option. You need to be considerate of, obviously, if you're using that equity to bring into the super fund, that equity is not available to you personally, and those types of things. Well, so there's a number of things that need to be considered, but there are also a number of solutions as well if you wanted to continue acquiring with inside the super fund as well.
And it all comes down to getting the right team around you, so you're getting the right advice.
Absolutely.
I always say, Chris, teamwork makes the dream work.
Certainly
does. And we're definitely making the dream work at the minute, mate. So
appreciate
your help with all of this, mate. Appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast.
No problem.
And we'll see how it goes over the next 12, 18, 24 months. I think we can probably record another one just to talk about some of the success that we've had out of this, and then if any other products have come available that we're not aware of right now.
Yep, perfect.
Chris Morris, thank you very much for coming to the podcast.
Thanks, Neil.
Join us again next week, guys. And remember, every master was once a disaster. Every winner was once a beginner.
Thanks for watching. Make sure you tune in the same time next week so you can stay up to date with all cash flow positive property updates.